Station wagons were extremely popular amongst families in the mid-60s and into the 1970s. And the 1967 Pontiac lineup was also a pretty awesome lineup, but clearly Pontiac planners thought that they were missing something in their car portfolio, because in 1967 they would introduce what I believe is the shortest-lived wagon nameplate in Pontiac history, and that is the Executive Safari. The Executive Safari would be produced from 1967 through 1970, when both it as well as the Executive nameplate were sunset. And in 1971, there would be no more Pontiac Executive. Remember, in 1971, the Pontiac Granville would become the top of the line. The Bonneville would go one down in the prestige ranking order. And then there was the Catalina that was at the base level of the Pontiac lineup. But for 1967, you had the Catalina. Then you had an increasing price order, the Executive, and then you had the Bonneville. And such was the case with the wagons as well. You had the Catalina Safari, then the Executive Safari, and then the Bonneville Safari. So today we're going to take a look at this particular maize-colored 1967 Pontiac Executive Safari. Now, this particular 67 Executive Safari is finished in a color called Mayfair Maize. I'm not quite sure why it was labeled that. Maybe somebody stayed at the Mayfair Townhouse in London, and it has a little bit of this mazy color scheme to it. But this wagon is, a little jaundiced. I'm not quite sure that I care for the color, but it's still a cool wagon nonetheless. It's got a black interior, as you're going to see. But let's first rotate around to the side of this particular Mayfair Maize Executive Safari. Now, one of the things that's hard to see in this picture, but this car, believe it or not, has a vinyl top on the wagon. Ooh, somebody ordered a vinyl roof on their wagon. I have no idea why, but vinyl roofs were all the rage during this time frame. In any case, the 67 Pontiacs had this distinctly different front end from the 65 and 66s. This would be the last year for the stacked headlamp Pontiacs before they would revert back to the sideways orientation headlamps on the 1968 models. The only full-size Pontiac that did not have stacked headlamps for 1967 was the Grand Prix, which employed the same front end effectively, but Pontiac designers and engineers just switched out that top panel. Notice that the header panel is divided into three pieces. There's a left piece, a center piece, and then a right piece. On the Grand Prix, the centerpiece would remain the same, but the left and the right would change, and that would be where the turn signal markers would go on the Grand Prix, these kind of shark gills style turn signal markers. And then in the lower area, it would have hidden headlamps. So they made just a couple minor modifications. You could use the same hood, the same midsection of the header panel, and a lot of the same front end components on the Grand Prix as well as the Executive, but it gave it a completely different look. Now, the Executive Safaris came with this fake wood grain trim, and that was one of the things that you got when you got your Executive Safari. So you didn't get, let's say, all the luxury trappings of the Bonneville Safari, but one thing you did get was your fake wood grain, because that connoted luxury on wagons in 1967. And notice the grill opening there, kind of this air intake style opening. Very similar to the 1962 Grand Prix. If you want to know more about the design of the 67 Pontiac front ends, take a look on my channel for a video with Dick Rusin. He was one of the designers on this 1967 Pontiac and did the original artwork associated with it. He's also recently published a book called Designing Dreams. If you haven't bought it yet, I highly recommend it. In any case, take a look at that body side molding too here and how wide it is. This is no, let's say, body side molding for wimps. This is a authoritative body side molding. And then you have the skeg line still on the wagon ahead of the rear wheel, similar to the other cars in the lineup. Now, one thing that I really missed by this point on wagons is the hardtops design. And General Motors would stop that many years earlier. I believe the 1958s were the last of the hardtop wagons. So by this point, you have the frame door glass and the B-pillars. Wagon still looks cool, but I always thought the hardtop wagons were the best. And as we wrap around to the side, you can really see that faux wood grain trim and how I guess it makes the body look a little bit, more attractive than without it. I guess it's growing on me a little bit the more I looked at this picture. But one thing about the executive wagon and all the Pontiac wagons for 1967 is that they interestingly rode atop the short Pontiac wheelbase, the 121-inch wheelbase that was used on the Catalinas as well as the Grand Prix. They did not ride atop the longer 124-inch wheelbase that was used for the executives as well as the Bonnevilles in terms of the coupes and four-doors. So if you got the wagon, you got cheated a little bit. And interestingly, as time would go on, when you got a GM wagon, they would switch to it actually being the longer wheelbase wagon. Like on the clamshell wagons, they would be the longest of the, let's say, Buick, Oldsmobile, Pontiac, Chevrolet wheelbases for the cars. But if you got a Ford wagon, you got the short wheelbase. You got the Ford LTD wheelbase. And Chrysler also went with the long wheelbase too. So depending on which wagon you got either a good deal or maybe you got a less good deal when you were procuring it because you had less wheelbase and thus a little bit less rear seat room. Now this is really where it starts to get fun because you can see the vinyl roof here and notice where the molding is in between the D-pillar and then the quarter panel. You can see that is the dividing line between the vinyl roof and the sheet metal. So like I said, for whatever reason, somebody wanted a vinyl roof on their wagon, but here it is, including the roof rack. So interesting styling feature. Now, another interesting styling feature is that these for 1967 were really the only Pontiacs to have these vertical tail lamps that you see here. And what's interesting about it is they're really in the style of a number of other 1967 Pontiacs, but just rotated 90 degrees so that they're vertical. They look kind of similar to me, similar to the GTO tail lamps of 1967, these kind of twin thin slits. But as I mentioned, obviously these are vertical versus horizontal. And the Grand Prix also had tail lamps similar to the GTO, those twin thin slits. So I guess here the Pontiac designers just didn't want to do the horizontal lamps because then you're obviously impinging on the rear tailgate. And, well, that could be complicated from a wiring perspective because that tailgate has to open and close and the lift gate has to drop down, or I should say the window glass has to drop down inside of the tailgate as well. So your Pontiac designers just went easy, I think, and executed this type of tail lamp design. And here's one last exterior view, the dead-on rear view. Now, I do find it interesting that there's a rub strip here, a little molding, right above the Pontiac block lettering on the tailgate. What that is for, I am not quite sure. I guess if a shopping cart comes and hits the back of your Pontiac Executive Safari, it is now protected. It just seems bizarre to me to put that rub strip there. I can't figure out exactly why, because obviously the bumper is sitting proud of it to help protect it. Although this is a somewhat decorative bumper, I do enjoy how it continues. Notice the scalloped out section around the tail lamps. That form continues into the bumper, so it is harmonious in that way. And it has the tiniest of reverse lights inset into the bumper. I hope that you don't back into anything because one of those will likely get damaged. My guess is that's a pretty rare Pontiac part to find nowadays because they probably were damaged backing into various items. Now, inside your Executive Safari, you got some luxurious trappings, beautiful full vinyl seats. I say that in a bit oxymoronic fashion, but they were quite comfortable. You did get this new for 1967 three-spoke wheel. Pontiac had this lucite portion of the wheel in prior years that actually used to be on the top and the bottom of the wheel, but by 1967 it was just on the top portion, presumably because this was a three-spoke wheel versus those other ones being a two-spoke wheel. But you do have the Pontiac emblem in the middle, that in the hub, and you can't quite see it, but beneath the Pontiac logo it says energy absorbing, and that's because this was the inaugural year for the energy-absorbing steering column in 1967. 1967 would also be the first year that the dual-chamber master cylinder was required equipment. So quite a few standard safety features came into vehicles in 1967. And, well, at least on various, let's say, car companies, the Pontiac had this energy-absorbing steering column. On Ford, they had the so-called flower pot wheel on all the 67 Fords so that the hub itself could absorb a fair amount of the shock associated with a crash. Now, you do notice as well that you get nicely trimmed pedals and bright work, and I believe that this, by this point, is a fake wood grain dash. I don't think that this is real anymore. Of course, 1966 was still real on the Bonnevilles and upper-end Pontiacs, but nonetheless, a pretty handsome place to be overall. You still did get, from an HVAC control standpoint, the Pontiac, I'll call it second radio. Notice it looks like the car has two radios, but that is actually the HVAC controls we're going to see in a close-up here. And here's a close-up of the dash. I did confirm after reading the brochure again that this is indeed just fake wood. It is not a real wood veneer anymore. It's walnut-styled wood, as the brochure for 1967 calls it. Interestingly, you did get a different wood grain in the Bonneville versus the Executive, or fake wood grain, that is. You got a Carpathian elm-styled wood grain dash. Notice they say styled in the brochure, which means that it's no longer real. Wah, wah. Cost-cutting had already started to hit at Pontiac in 1967, I suppose. But you can see here that HVAC control that looks like a radio. The right knob is what you turn to make the air hotter or colder. It also increases the fan speed slightly, and the left knob is the blower. There were multiple positions on the blower speed, but like I said, if you rotated the right knob left to right, it also would increase the blower speed a little bit. For example, if you wanted more heat, it would not only send more coolant through the heater core to make the outbound air hotter, but it would also increase the blower speed just a little bit too while it did that. And before we go on to talk about powertrains, thought we'd just take a look at the interior seats. Nice seats overall, kind of nondescript. You can see the door panel as well as good looking, but also, these interiors for 1967 weren't quite as nice as they were in prior years. The 65 and 6 Pontiacs, to my mind, really have the best interiors of any Pontiac overall. Still looks good in 67, just not quite as good. And as usual, let's finish out under hood. So in this particular 1967 Executive, this has the standard 400 cubic inch two-barrel V8. There were two variants of the 400 two-barrel. There was a low compression that made 265 horsepower, a high compression that made 290 horsepower, and they were standard in different models depending on whether or not you got a car with a manual transmission, in which case you got the low compression 400, or you got a car with a turbo-hydromatic automatic, in which case you got the high compression V8 standard. You could get the 265 horsepower low compression engine as a no-cost option on any of the Pontiacs, though. So this was the standard engine in the Catalinas, the Executives, the Catalina Safari, the Executive Safari, and then if you got the Bonneville or the Bonneville Safari or the Grand Prix, you got a standard 325 horsepower, 400 cubic inch four-barrel high compression V8. That was if you got the automatic. If you got the manual, you got a 333 horsepower variant. Why you got an additional 8 horsepower with the manual, I have no idea. But, well, that's the way that it was. Optional in the wagons, the best engine that you could get was a 360 horsepower, 428 cubic inch V8. You could not get the high output 428 engine in wagons, but you could get the 360 horsepower 428. Now, 1967 was the first year that Pontiac had enlarged its V8s from the typical 389 cubic inch displacement. That became the 400, and then the 421 cubic inch engine became the 428. Not sure why Pontiac only punched their engines out just a few cubic inches. It seems like it's not worth the effort. I suppose that on the base car, they wanted to be able to round up to 400. 400 sounds a lot better than 389. And on the 421, well, I guess they just wanted something a little bit bigger. There were other car companies that had, let's say, 425 cubic inch V8s, and Ford also had, don't forget, the 428 in a number of cars. So Pontiac matched it as opposed to being down a little bit on cubes, I suppose. And there you have it, the shortest lived nameplate in Pontiac wagon history, the Executive Safari that only made it from 1967 through 1970, after which it would be gone but not forgotten, as we talked about it here today. Put a comment in the comment section. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and thanks again for watching.